Hi, everyone. Welcome to another issue of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. We're on an in-betweener, in between our episodes where we talk about the latest issue of the magazine that's currently being written, but secrets till next time. And we decided this time that we were going to talk about the effects of weather on ancient warfare. So joining me are our regular panelists, Mark DeSantis, Mark McCaffrey, Lindsay Powell, and Mike Cole. Jasper is AOL. I think the weather held him up. So I'm hosting, which is always exciting. And who would like to kick us off with the effects of weather? We've already talked off camera about which battles they're going to discuss and who was going to fight about who wanted to do the same battle as someone else. So we'll let play.
I'll start. I just had a handful of naval battles I wanted to talk about. Weather played some role. One was the 429 Battle of Chalkis from the Archidamian War of the Peloponnesian War. That battle, the Peloponnesian fleet was trying to cross the Gulf of Corinth, had a larger fleet than the Athenians, but the Athenians were much more talented rowers. The crossing was occurring during the night, and the Peloponnesian fleet adopted a kuklos formation, which was where they pointed all of their bows outwards in a defensive posture so that the Athenians wouldn't be able to attack them so easily. But the Athenians started rowing around them, right? That's how much better they were. The Athenian admiral at the time was named Phormio. He knew that in the morning the wind would pick coming from the Gulf of Corinth, and that pushed the Peloponnesian ships together, and that's when he attacked. And it was a big resounding victory for the Athenians. In another battle, this comes from the Ionian War in the years later, 406 BC, the weather impacted the Battle of Arginusae in 406 BC. A huge storm came up after the Athenian victory, and because of the storm, the Athenian generals, so there are 10 generals in charge of the Athenian fleet, they didn't pick up the dead in the water. And when they got back to Athens, they were put on trial, and 6 were executed immediately. So the weather there played a role in more or less taking away of very talented Athenian generals because of this failure. Finally, 2 naval, not battles, but storms that took place during the First Punic War. First one, 255 BC, the Roman fleet is off of Camarina, Sicily, and a tremendous storm comes up. 384 Roman ships. Not certain how many people would have been on each ship, but potentially as many as 284 of those 364 ships actually are destroyed. And the loss of life, depending on how many people were on board, would have been worse than that at Cannae later, which is usually considered to be the most terrible one-day death toll. Another storm came in 53 and killed tens of thousands of other Roman sailors. The Romans actually lost more men to storms during the First Punic War than enemy action. So storms during naval battles.
2 things. One was going to segue to one of Lindsay's battles, but firstly, and I'll go to Mike for confirmation. It wasn't till I was in Greece where the speed at which a storm comes up in Greece is lightning fast. Like I was honeymooning in Greece, and I was the chef/villa person in a villa on Skiathos, and we hosted dinner parties, and I would cook for the dinner parties. And there was this storm coming, but there was a dinner party on. European, non-Greek Europeans coming. We're having our dinner party regardless of the weather, and it was amazing because the storm front moving in, and there was this light coming towards the beach of this villa, and sure enough, it was one of the guests had hired a Greek fisherman to drop her off, and she then, with her gown in a sealed bag, dove into the water, swam ashore, and then came up and was dripping wet, and then dried off and put on again. But it was so amazing to see the light receding from this fisherman who knew he had X amount of time to get home again, and had to be in port before that storm hit. And I think when you think about the Persian 1204 ships accompanying Xerxes' invasion, whether we believe
purported 1,200,
whether we believe the numbers or not. But you know, detaching half of them to sail around Euboea and then being destroyed in a storm. We sit there and go,
that's the second storm. Don't forget that.
The second storm. Oh, yeah, this earlier. But that idea.
Reportedly lost a third of their fleet on the coast of Magnesia coming around Thessaly. And this is this, and you're absolutely right about the speed of storms. And this is maybe not a one-to-one correlation, but from firefighting, this is for the listeners, you really get to respect natural speed. And this is related to wind, which is also what moves storms. I have fought wildfires. And the thing that all firefighters fear most is what we call a wind-driven fire. And I'm not kidding. I've had this experience of I have forestry line and we are fighting a fire and that fire is 50 feet away from me. And then in a quarter second, I am standing. I have had that experience. It moves that fast when the wind picks up. And you wonder, like, how are these firefighters getting killed? And you realize, oh my God, like you blink and it's there. And storms are the same way when they're wind-driven. It's out to sea. You don't even know it's there. You see clouds or thunder in the distance, and the next thing you know, it's in the fleet. And I can't say that that's what's happened. I mean, look, the Phoenician captains that were in the employ of Xerxes when he was both, making that entree to Artemision and then trying to get around Euboea down the Maricos Channel, they knew their business. They knew their business as well as anyone in the ancient world. But it is entirely possible they got caught out. The other thing I think that's really important to keep in mind is those coastlines. So when we talk about ancient vessels, and Mark, I think this also plays into Arganuse, because I think there was a beaching attempt, right, at some point there, is you have to have a sand shingle to get that trireme up or whatever, your transport or whatever. And you got to remember, you're backing it in, right? You're backing oars because you want that ram out in the water. You put that ram, you come in ram first, there's going to be a hell of a time getting off the beach. It really is. So there's some maneuver to it. And if you look at the coast of Magnesia even today, and if you look at the coast of the southeastern portion of Euboea, which is where they were hit when they were rounding it, there is no place to go, man. Like there is no sand available. It's like a coastline of razor blades. It's really worth seeing.
Yeah, I wonder also whether it was, amazing seamen from Anatolia, but not Aegean seamen. And I wonder whether the reason for the destruction of the fleet twice is because which was where I was going with the Greek fisherman getting home, knowing he could, they knew how long they had, and the Persian fleet, Cilician captains, Sidonian captains, Phoenician captains may have thought we've got longer, or, that storm's half an hour away. You're like, no, you got about 4 minutes. So whereas the locals would have been like,
you don't think it was Leonidas commanding his people to sacrifice to Poseidon?
Well, definitely. But a bit like in Aulus before the Trojan War. The only reason that the Greeks actually get to Troy is for the sacrifice of the daughter. So Iphigenia.
So
yes.
I want to throw this wrench or spanner, as I'm in the UK right now, to this. How much can we rely on these ancient accounts for an accurate depiction of the weather? Because to some degree, there is the fact of it is a dramatic narrative device, and I'm going to read you.
Before you do, I'm going to throw a wrench back at you, which is how much can we trust? How much can we trust our accounts for anything? Not just the weather.
I want to hear what he's reading.
So I'm reading my Osprey book, which is Combat 6, Roman Soldier versus Germanic Warrior, which I talk about the Battle of Teutoburg. And I'll just simply read this because it's easier than me trying to make this thing. The only Roman historian to mention the weather at the time of the Battle of Teutoburg Pass is Cassius Dio, who wrote some 200 years after the massacre, quoting, "Meanwhile, a violent rain and wind came up that separated them still further, while the ground that had become slippery around the roots and logs made walking very treacherous for them, and the tops of the trees kept breaking off and falling down, causing much confusion." That's Roman History 5620.3. So Velleius Paterculus, who lived at the time of the events and gives the earliest account of them, doesn't even mention the weather, and neither does the contemporary historian Florus. Dio was likely drawing on a Roman stereotype that Germania was cold and wet. Tacitus observed in his book on Germania, their country, though somewhat various in appearance, yet generally either bristles with forests or reeks with swamps, it is more rainy than this side of the Gallia, bleaker than the Noricum and Pannonia, which is Germania 5, by the way. Tacitus is the only Roman historian to call the location by the name Saltus Teutoburgiensis, Annals 1.6, where Saltus can mean pass, a ravine, or a glade, or a pasture, or a woodland, but does so in the context of the visit of the site several years later by Germanicus Caesar. These ancient world stereotypes and ambiguities of language obscure the details of the battles. The point I'm trying to make is this, is if 200 years after the battle, we're now learning what the rain was, and people who contemporary don't mention it. How can we trust the source?
Well, I mean, it is also possible he's working off of another source that we've lost. But you're right that we can't trust it, and we don't know. You're absolutely right. I will say one exception, Lindsay, is the sun, the position of the sun. There is computer software which I've seen where you can pick a date and a location, and you can go back 2,500 years. It'll light the Google Earth map and show you where the sun's shining. And it's been incredibly useful to reckon with the sources. One of the examples I was going to give was Pydna, which is 167 or 168 BC, that Lucius Aemilius Paulus reorients the Roman line because the sun's in their eyes. And we were able to confirm, I think Mike Livingston and I wrote about this for Ancient Warfare magazine, that this was inaccurate because when we light the battlefield, the sun was not shining when we thought it was.
I think the interesting thing about that, though, is yes, there are tropes. Yes, there are stereotypes. I mean, to this day, we debate what the weather was like at Waterloo in 1815, because some sources mention it, some sources don't. And I think the reality of writing about war and remembering war and recalling the important events of your battle is it's different for everyone. So the fact is that the weather may have been a factor, but not for whoever that person wrote, who they spoke to. So I mean, the same with Adrianople. The sun's shining in your eyes, but there's also smoke from fires. You're like, well, which is it? If you've got smoke from fires, you haven't got the sun shining in your eyes. Certainly not as the defining factor of the battle. And you get the same.
Why don't you have smoke from fires and the sun shining at the same time? That's how I've experienced that.
But couldn't you have, say, you're getting something more trustworthy when you go to Battle of Bedriacum 2, and you've got the Third Gallica Legion supposedly heralding the sun coming up at dawn, and of course confusing everyone whether they can see some sort of reinforcements arriving and whatnot. You get the different versions as to it's actually putting off the enemy or it's encouraging the fellow troops. But something like that is so unique that you can have a little bit more faith that actually, yes, we are going off something that does accurately reflect weather at the time.
I think I'm just arguing for caution, because I've seen it written in lots of places where people will say, statement of fact, it rained at Teutoburg. No, not according to. So I think like ancient sources, modern writers will seize upon a thing. I mean, the same with the Battle of Vercellae. I think it's in Plutarch's Life of Sulla, where there's such a big cloud of dust that Marius, according to probably Sulla himself, misses the Gallic army and completely avoids them on the battlefield. You're like, is this the same Gallic army that spans the entire width of the valley? How on earth did he miss that? And then, a few sentences later, oh yes, and the sun was shining in their eyes. You're like, wait, is this a cloud of dust or is this sun shining in their eyes?
But then there's more being written on that more recently about perhaps that's actually recording weather phenomenon in terms of dust storms.
Yes, my take is no, it's an anti-Marian tradition that tries to remove any credit for the battle from Marius. But getting back to Adrianople, the interesting thing is that we're told the hour of the battle by another source, only one of them, and it says it's fought at around midday. You're like, well, you've got to be in a weird position for the sun to be in your eyes at midday in Thrace. So I think the problem with those stereotypes you're talking about, Lindsay, is that some get put into battles where they're not relevant, but they're put there because they explicate a certain feature of the battle, which for whatever reason the author goes, oh, that would explain it.
Yeah. So you beautifully lead me. Yeah. So you beautifully lead me. Then segue. I think the trendy word is to the Battle of Actium, where maybe just there's some truth in the story that has come down to us. And the situation is this: we're talking 31 BC, where actually the Gulf of Gomeros, of Sea of Ambracia, and the Ionian Sea. So it's on the western side of the Western Balkans. And Antony and Cleopatra's ships are trapped on the inside of the bay, and Octavian and his general Agrippa are on the other side. And on the 29th, we're told, according to sources including Plutarch, a Great Depression comes over, and it's windy and it's rainy. And you can imagine these commanders are stuck in their leather tents, and they're just bewailing the fact that they've been here for 5 months already, and it's mosquito infested. And then finally, 5 days later, the depression goes away, and they deploy for battle. And around the array of ships is that the battle formation from Cleopatra and Antony basically sails out from the Sea of Ambracia, the Gulf, and Agrippa and Octavian's ships form a sort of an arc on the seaward side. They're basically like an umbrella shape. They sort of to capture any movement that way. And the legend goes that Agrippa had already known that there's a wind called the Yapix, which blows from the northwest eastward. And that would fill the sails, right? So his mission is to keep the other ships at bay long enough for this wind, the Yapix, to blow. And sure enough, this is exactly what happens. And it's something that's mentioned in Plutarch in the context of Antony. It's also picked up in Virgil, who then talks in flowery language about this. But what's really intriguing is Yapix, of course, is a mythological name, which goes, it's a favorite of the god Apollo, who, of course, is also the favorite god of Augustus. So what I go back to is in the sense that you may just have this curious, there may be the nugget of a real truth here. That fate has turned on the fact that Augustus's favorite god, his favorite, produces this wind, and his greatest general wins the battle for him. So again, I just say these things to be cautious. There are just more mentions of this wind in the context of Actium than there are of rain in the context of Teutoburg. So that's my piece.
Yeah, but I think, again, they're tropes that get seized upon. So if I jump forward from Actium 200 years odd, the miracle of the rain, which is depicted famously on Marcus Aurelius's column, the story, and again, the sources are incredibly fragmentary for the battle, but the story is that Marcus Aurelius has invaded Dacia and has been surrounded by the enemy to the point that they are expiring of thirst. And the enemy are not attacking them; they are letting them, die of thirst. And then it gets interesting because two things happen at the same moment. One is there's a rain burst over the Romans, and they drink and fight at the same time. The second is that there are lightning strikes only on the Dacians, and they run away from these lightning strikes into the ranks of the Romans to try and take shelter from the lightning and get killed and lose the battle. But the fascinating thing about the rain is that according to contemporary Christian sources, now this is 175 AD, so this is long before the triumph of Christianity. But we have Justin, a letter appended to Justin Martyr, who's killed not long after, a decade after. So it's a contemporary forgery, but the letter claims that the responsibility for the rain occurring when that rain occurred was from Christian soldiers in Marcus Aurelius's army. The fascinating thing about that is that in no official way at the time would Christians try and take the credit for it, because there's another official religion, and according to Dio Cassius's fragments, they're there too. So there's lots of people praying for rain.
That wouldn't be a backward-looking Christian apologetic that somehow got incorporated in as a contemporary source, because that is absolutely something Christians would come behind and do. The source
that claims it is like where it's first recorded, and we do have a slightly later contemporary author referring to the letter. So, writing at about 200. So writing 25 years later, he talks about the letter that we have. But I
guess my question is, there's no chance, this is where source pedigree becomes critical. So for example, what is our original source for this contemporary source? Is it a medieval copyist, right? Because in a lot of cases, for example, I don't know what the oldest manuscript for Herodotus is. I have no idea. But in some cases, I don't know, we say, I don't know, Plutarch wrote at the turn of the 1st century AD or whenever he wrote. But the reality of it is but what is our oldest copy that we're working from? Oh, it's a 5th century copy from a monastery. Well, yeah, man, those monks might have doctored that,
I think the fact that you've got Tertullian referring to the letter that survives in the Justin Martyr tradition means you've got another contemporary referring to the letter they've seen. So it can't be a medieval copyist embedding evidence in two different authors. But the fascinating thing about that is the credit for the reign. And then the second thing about it is, which is fascinating about the letter, because the letter names huge numbers of legions, like 5 legions, but it doesn't name Legio 12 Fulminata. Now, according to the contemporary sources, they wrongly say that the reason that Fulminata, the Thundering Legion, gets its name is from fighting in that battle. And you're like, well, no, because it's Mark Antony's legion and he uses Fulminata back in 36 BC. So it had that name. And then the letter doesn't mention, of all the legions it mentions, it doesn't mention 12. So it's this kind of, but the fascinating thing about it is it's all connected to the weather, because in that case, the weather was so integral to the victory that several contemporaries claim responsibility for it.
Hey, before we move too far from the point, I want to go back to what you said about missing the Gallic army, this Gallic army that was so huge. Do you remember missing it in the
Keller, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm actually not surprised at all. And as a good contemporary example of that, we have maneuvering before Kenokephale. I just thought of that, and I should be embarrassed of myself. I forget what year it was fought, but we have
197.
Thank you, Philip V campaigning against. And can you believe it? I wrote a book on this thing, and I can't remember. Philip V campaigning against Flamininus, and these are armies. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's something like 20 to 40 grand per side. And they are right on top of each other, and they know where each other is. And I think there are at least 3 different sources that all confirm they missed each other in the fog. And the only reason that they found each other is that they both happened to send skirmishers to the highest point, which was the Kenokephale Hills, to try to, as the fog was burning off, and they ran into each other. And that turned into a general engagement that nobody wanted.
Mind you, I think fog is a different one, because fog is, if anyone's been driving in fog or walking in fog, even in familiar territory, and it is unfamiliar all of a sudden. And if you hear someone speaking who you think is right next to you, and in fact they're far away, they've lost you, you're like, but we were meters apart. So I think fog is a discombobulating.
It's another perfect example of that is Lake Tresmain, 218 BC. In terms of Hannibal positioning his troops, having already scouted out the area along the banks of the lake, and then positioning his troops over the crest of the hill, or hill line as such, and then waiting for the Romans to come in. And of course, the Romans, haven't scouted out the area beforehand, but at the same time, we're told that I think it's most of the translations say it mist, but you could sort of see it as probably more fog in terms of.
Hold on, Mark. What's the difference? What's the operating difference between mist and fog? They're interchangeable, right?
Oh, meteorological. I think mist burns off quicker than fog. Find out.
The internet.
No, yeah.
Go on with your story.
What is the difference?
I'll leave that to you, Mike. Okay.
Yeah. Oh. Called out.
Anyway, well, in terms of Lake Tresmain, we're told it does burn off eventually as such, because the vanguard that actually breaks through and continues on and then turns around and realizes that they've lost the rest of their 30,000 troops behind them. Then we're told, I think, just trying to think who it is, Polybius maybe, saying that they turn around and as the fog burns off, they realize, or they can see the devastation behind them emerging as such. So,
Mark, you're not going to like this. The term fog is used when microscopic droplets reduce horizontal visibility at the Earth's surface to less than 1 kilometer, while the term mist is used when the droplets do not reduce horizontal visibility to less than 1 kilometer. That is the answer.
That is a PhD right there. Mist or fog?
I'm walking away from this.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. But that discombobulating aspect of fog, it's a bit like night fighting. And, the number of battles, it's not really weather, I suppose, but, time of sunset, yes, because, the number of ancient battles that stop because of night. And my favorite is the Catalonian plains where, Theodoric ends up in the enemy camp. How do you end up in the enemy camp? Because night came on and they got so involved in the battle that they end up in the wrong place and, almost die. And, X is thought to be dead because he actually ended up in the Roman camp. You're like, oh my gosh. So, I think there's several battles that are delayed late in the day because of knowledge of the sunset. And so that, the fighting won't take that long. That's different. That's, is that weather?
It depends on what comes on in the night. Taking that to a totally different situation. Alexander and the Hydaspes campaign, 326 BC. In terms of he's moving into the Punjab, he's already got the Taxiles on side and whatnot. He's collected something in the range of about 5,000 extra troops from the locality. Porus and his Indians are holding the east bank of the Hydaspes. And of course, Alexander scouts up and down the river to find a potential place for crossing out of range of, or, not confronting head on the elephant troops of Porus, and he finds a position about 7.5 kilometers, I think. No, 7.5 miles, sorry, north of the position. So therefore prepares overnight and is ready to go in the morning. Unfortunately, what the night brings is actually a storm. And so subsequently, to start with, these troops are hesitant in terms of undertaking the crossing of the Hydaspes. Actually, I should say the crossing of the Hydaspes across to what they perceive as being a island, which actually turns out to be 2 islands in the middle of the river. His troops are initially hesitant, but then afterwards he gets them going, and it's actually, we're told, the noise of the storm, which actually helps him because it hides the noise that his troops are making in their efforts to actually cross the river, and so allows him that little extra time that possibly means that Porus has actually sent either depending on which source you read, either a son or an uncle, I think, with a scouting group, and they miss the crossing because of the noise of the storm. They can't pick up where Alexander is crossing. Again, you sort of say, is this a trope that's being brought out to sort of say, he's crossing under unimaginable circumstances. It's more adversity than given in the first place. But then later on in his first action after crossing, he comes up against this scouting unit, and which is made up of cavalry and the charioteers. Charioteers are basically, it's a 6-man chariot that the Indians are touting at the time. And so 2 drivers, 2 javelin men, and 2 archers. But the things get stuck in the mud, and so therefore play absolutely no part, and picked off by the cavalry that Alexander's brought across in his initial attack. So we've got 2 sort of elements of the battle, crucial elements taking place in terms of both being aided by the weather conditions coming across, and it's the weather that we sort of said, is night a situation? Is night to be considered as weather? It's the weather that's brought on with the night as such.
Well,
I think another.
Sorry, just before we move from night, correct me if I'm wrong here. Epipolae, which is kind of the famous night, you held out as an example of why you don't fight at night. That was a clear night, wasn't it? This is Syracuse. This is 4 BC. That was. There's I think they talk about, a few of the sources confirm that they have both moon and stars to navigate by. It doesn't help them at all.
Well, the march before Plataea as well, the night march, and several other attacks at night that go badly wrong. Another aspect of a Southern Hemisphere person going to Greece was, we have storms in the Southern Hemisphere, absolutely, but they are nothing like the lightning storms in Greece. The 8 hours of night lightning, and you fear for your life, and you can completely understand Zeus the Thunderer. And I think the volume of a storm in Greece for me was astounding in comparison to, big storms in New Zealand and earthquakes and all sorts of things. In my experience, nothing was like the volume and the sustained volume of those lightning storms in Greece in late summer. So technically, from an ancient warfare, because I'm that kind of geek, this would have been about what it was like. And it's quite remarkable that I'm still here, because we had a lightning storm at Delphi when we were at Delphi, and there was an entire busload of American tourists, and they all scattered for the bus. And I said to my new wife, I am not abandoning Delphi. Here's this tree over here. Let's take shelter under this tree while the lightning is striking all around us. I was doing so clearly the gods were smiling on me, because we then had Delphi.
No, I just admit your marriage held. She didn't
newly washed. No, look, my wife knew already. By the time we got married, I'd given her all the warning signs. So she knew what she was in for. Still does. So the funny thing about that was that A, Delphi was newly washed, and B, abandoned. We had Delphi to ourselves for an hour, which was awesome and very unusual in the height of tourist season. Thank you, lightning storm. But that wasn't so. That idea of the missing an army in a storm, absolutely, you can understand it, and being fearful in a storm and not being able to maneuver or get your troops to do what you want them to in that kind of condition is completely understandable. And even more recently, battles in Southeast Asia and even World War II, where whether it be storms or freezing conditions, such in Bastogne and the Battle of the Bulge. So all of those sorts of things are absolutely critical in some battle experiences. I mean, I was going to mention the Rhine or the Danube freezing over, which is again a trope. You get this, it froze over. And Ovid in his exile, and I believe his exile to Thomas is a real thing. I don't believe it's a fiction, which I think has become trendy. But I think there's enough details that he gives us that show that he does know what he's talking about. In the 10 years that he's there, 8 AD to 18 AD, he records that the Danube freezes over 3 times. So it's not an every year occurrence. And, there are certain moments later in Roman history into the 5th century where we get recording of the Rhine or the Danube freezing, but it's not every year. But the thing that's fascinating is when it does, the barbarians on the northern bank of either river are ready to raid. And again, when you look at Marcus Aurelius's wars, and of course there is the famous battle on the ice where they're lured back, the Romans are lured back onto the ice, and that's where the battle is fought. On the frozen river itself. And there's a famous anecdote that survives of Marcus Aurelius, not his subordinate commanders, commanding the Romans to put their shields on the ice and stand on their shields as a way of giving them a better grip, which is a fascinating.
A better grip, or to distribute weight more evenly so they don't fall through?
Better grip is how it's described. And to receive the charge of the Sarmatians. So, I think that's probably something else as well, Mike, is that ancient sources interpreting phenomena or tactics may not be, they didn't talk to a veteran, they didn't talk to a commander, they just read an account and gone, that will be because of this. And it's like, no, that wasn't because of that. That was an entirely different reason, but that's not the reason that the ancient source gives. So, we need to be we do need to be wary of rationalizing to the point of completely rewriting what our source is telling us. But then there are certain things about, one of my favorite is when artillery is invented, and it kind of shatters, for lack of a better term, the idea that the atmosphere is made up of glass spheres, because clearly how can you have glass spheres when you've got solid balls moving through the air and smashing them all? So those sorts of moments of epiphanies where things become, it's not the way we understood it at all, it's a different thing entirely.
One broader it almost seems so obvious it's not worth mentioning, but it is worth mentioning in any conversation about weather, is that ancient warfare is a seasonal occupation by and large, right? To the point where when someone is conducting operations in winter, it's a big deal, and the sources are noting it. Now, I know that that's not specifically weather, but it really is, right? It's strategic. We're discussing the tactical applications of weather, but when you look at it strategic, this is a known thing. And also the fact that armies are limited by their ability to forage and drive meat on the hoof. Like, there's all these logistical concerns that are really, they can entirely dependent on the season. Now, that needs to be mentioned. Although I don't know that
Well, again, the horde armies, the Huns, for instance, the idea that we get the idea that their ponies are shaggy and they look misshapen and they're not real horses. And then when you go and you see the Taki herd that's in Western Sydney, which is probably more accessible, Western Sydney. It's called the Western Sydney Zoo, but it's actually in Dubbo, 5 hours away. But it's more accessible than Mongolia, for instance. That's what I mean. Is they grow additional hair.
I want to pause very, very. I want to pause and appreciate the reminder to our listeners that the Western Sydney Zoo is more accessible than Mongolia. That should be remarked.
I never thought we'd be talking about Dubbo Zoo on this.
Dubbo Zoo, here we go. I may have blogged about it because I had a moment where I was writing the Osprey book on late Roman cavalryman versus Hunnic warrior. And I went to Western Plains Zoo in one of my other lives of running opera education. And I came around the corner because it's a big zoo and you have a golf cart to get around the zoo. And I came around the corner in the golf cart and there was a herd of Hunnic horses, and I was freaking out. And the reality is that in 1979, they were so endangered that they basically took breeding pairs away from Mongolian homelands and took them to other zoos around the world, including Dubbo. And the Dubbo breeding program was so successful that they've reseeded the flocks in the herds in Mongolia, and they now have 28 in Dubbo. And so anyway, I was watching these horses run. It was just amazing. It was like they saw me coming, and then they ran. They charged, not at me, but across their field, just to demonstrate to me what the Hunnic horde may have looked like. I was in seventh heaven. My wife and my daughters were just rolling their eyes at me, as they commonly do. But what was my point? My point was that they grow a sort of an additional layer of hair in winter, and that they then molt in early spring. And obviously they also have their foals in that period. So that's when the Huns would be on the move. So the Romans would see these shaggy, misshapen non-horses and describe them as such. But the reality was when they molt, they then become sleek stamina machines that can just run not particularly fast, but they can run for days without much, and what they need fodder-wise obviously is also growing at the same time when they come onto the campaign. So all of that sort of factors into the weather being, warfare being dependent upon the weather.
Which becomes a very interesting sort of conundrum when you sort of think about Alexander's his eventual army and the Hellenistic armies that come after him. And I guess it goes back to the Persians as well, where you've got these multinational or multi-ethnic groups within the armies. And of course, if you sort of take it one step further, they're also going to be, in terms of the cavalry, mounted on these different species or breeds of horse. And of course, each of those, the ones that you're talking about, great stamina and whatnot, but they are feeding off one particular variety, main vegetation. You've got other elements of those same armies on more the Arab-based horses, which again are going to be a total different kettle of fish in terms of their performance, in terms of when they're going to be at their peak, etc. So it sort of gives that an extra dimension to how is your army going to perform in which theatre of war and in which time of year.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing, is that when we think about the summer campaigning season, obviously the professionalization of various armies means that those campaigns are extended. But it's also where you are in the Mediterranean, because, Issus is fought in November and Belisarius he leaves Constantinople to invade Vandal North Africa in June, arrives in September, and he's fighting battles. I think the latest battle, Trichomarum, is 15th of December. So from our normal ideas about campaigning season, and something like Sphacteria and Delium Sphacteria is late in the campaigning season. And you're like, what is late? When is late in a Greek warfare context in the Peloponnesian War? Is it September? Is September late? Is it October? When does late happen?
Well, I think the answer to that is actually, it is tied to weather, but it's tied to weather obliquely. It has to do with harvest. It has to do with harvest because you're dealing with a levee system, and everyone's got to get home, or we're going to starve. Like it's that kind of a thing. And also, and actually, God, I wish I'd been prepared this way, because there are accounts also around that campaign in Scatusa that I was referencing around Kenokefale, Murray, where they talk specifically about making marches to coincide with when the harvest is being gathered in. And this is also the case in the Peloponnesian War, Mark, and a couple of land battles, which of course I don't have to mind, but I know that Thucydides talks about this, that Agis II, I think it might have been around First Mantinea, is making decisions about when to march and not march, based specifically on when the harvest is gathered in, because that affects the disposition of the defenders.
It's the same situation with Hannibal as well, in terms of deciding as he moves down into Italy, what is his tactic going to be? Is he going to move across to the eastern seaboard, or is he going to cross Apennine Mountains? He eventually is looking for where is the harvest going to be taking place. Etruria is his target for exactly that reason.
So actually, Mark, here's my question, though. Is he doing that because he wants to gather the harvest to feed his own troops, or because he thinks it will affect the disposition of the enemy?
I think he's looking at feeding his own troops at this stage, because he's had such a harsh crossing of the Alps. He's lost a huge amount of it. I think it's almost half of his army has been taken out, or not taken out necessarily actually by weather as such, but I think he has a huge number, go AWOL in terms of his troops, as well as those that he loses as such. So he's looking for something that's going to lift the morale of his troops. And so he's looking for where the harvest is going to be, ripening.
Well, also, the Spartan invasions of Attica during the Peloponnesian War too are timed to maximize the disruption to.
Yeah, but they were totally ineffective, Murray.
Totally ineffective, absolutely.
I hate to side with Victor Davis Hanson.
No, but the timing of it wouldn't make sense if they were invading after the harvest. So the timing of them was intended to be the most threatening to the harvest, but as you say, totally ineffective.
It's the devil is in the details for this stuff, because then you've got to get down to what crop, where, right? So really, this is an answerable question, but what I have to know is what exactly is the staple crops being grown in that area? What was their condition in that period? Because remember, modern olives are not ancient olives, but if we could figure that out, we can answer that question. What is late in the season?
Even some of the ideas of we do early harvest, and there are certain crops that if you harvest them early is pointless, but then there are other crops that you can indeed harvest and they will continue to ripen after being picked. For instance, I don't know enough about olives to know whether olives are in that field.
It's fruit, I think. It's mostly fruit. I think does that, because I know this just because Sarah is in agriculture, is that they will harvest, I think it's tomatoes early because they keep better and they can truck them. And then when they get to the destination, they introduce them to a gas. I can't remember the name of the gas, but the gas will trigger the ripening, and then they will be perfectly ripe to serve when they get to the destination.
Yeah, and all that kind of stuff. Like if you've got an avocado that's hard, you put it in with your apples, and that somehow ripens your avocado faster. All of that kind of knowledge is not something that we today have, because we can get tomatoes anywhere because they can be hot housed. There's the idea today, other than stone fruit, most seasonality of products is lost to us. We can buy it now because it's available now.
So on this topic, Epictetus's Discourses, one of the great philosophical things, remember, he says you would be a fool to wish for figs in winter, right? What an idiot wants figs in winter. And my thinking is, well, some idiot who wanted figs in winter came up with refrigeration. So we should be pretty happy for that fool. Now we have figs whenever we want them.
Not if you're Epictetus. Yes.
But actually, I don't even get it for his period, because even in his time period, he had to know about dried figs. He had figs in winter.
I mean, and again, one of the other things that's sort of missing, we've just gone through marmalade season. So, we've got friends from Greece who've never had marmalade because they don't do jamming in Greece, and so we've now made them marmalade addicts because they're like, this is magic in a jar. So and they're not big toast eaters because they're Greek, but spoon of marmalade every time you walk past apparently is the thing. I was introduced to marmalade on vanilla ice cream, and I'm like, what's this magic? That's something I've spent my entire youth never having eaten. I waited till I was 50. So I think there's, and the funny thing about a lot of these things is that when you start to extrapolate them out, they have such a big effect, whether it's, muddy underfoot or whether there's wind or whether there's rain, whether there's enough rain, whether there's a high tide or a low tide. I mean, I always wonder, I think the Latin for Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain in 55 BC is the high sea, and people are right, it means deep. Like, but is the sea up? Is it actually a stormy sea
because
rather than
altus? It's both.
Altus, yeah, altus. So it's a high sea, meaning a deep sea that the signifer of the 10th Legion jumps into. But is it actually a choppy? Is the sea up? So it's actually even more dangerous than. And
of course, the ancients aren't that au fait with the whole idea of extreme tides, as you sort of find when
because they come from the Mediterranean where they're absolutely, exactly. What's the strange thing? We're further away from the beach than we were yesterday. What magic is this? So yes.
Well, I am glad that we have covered the zoo and marmalade. I think we are giving
look. There's nothing better than having a wide-ranging discussion around ancient. Yeah, absolutely. We're ill-disciplined and wide-ranging. No problem. No. It keeps us on task. Yes, I don't know that we've covered everything that weather means to ancient warfare, but we've certainly, hopefully, set your minds ablaze to think about that there's basically nothing you can't think about when it comes to ancient warfare. So thank you for joining us. And I'd like to thank Mark, Lindsay, Mark, and Mike, because they've moved around my screen since we started. And of course, Angus for producing us all. And we will see you again next time.
Thanks, everyone.